Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract. Today, oh my gosh, in the house, legend, someone I've looked up to for years, Steve Blank. Thank you for joining. A short bio, and then we'll get right into it. An array of questions for you. Steve's the founding member at the Gordian Knot Center, an adjunct professor at Stanford University, senior fellow for innovation at Columbia University. Steve consults for the national security establishment on innovation methods, processes, or if you're American, policy or policies and doctrine. He created the curriculum for the National Science Foundation Innovation Corps at Stanford. He co-created the Department of Defense Hacking for defense and Department of State Hacking for diplomacy curriculums. Now, his story starts in 1978 when Steve arrived in Silicon Valley at the very beginning of the startup boom, where he founded or was part of 8 different ventures, some successful, maybe some not. Steve will chime in. His book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, is credited with launching the lean startup movement, in which touted the principle that startups must operate differently from big companies to be successful. His follow-on book, The Startup Owner's Manual, described a process for turning ideas into scale, and his Harvard Business Review cover story from, I think, 2013 redefined how large organizations can innovate at speed. In sum, Mr. Blank, as I should be calling him, has changed how startups are built, how entrepreneurship is taught, how science is commercialized, and how companies and the government innovate. He's been described, most appropriately, as the father of modern entrepreneurship. Mr. Blank, Steve, if I may, thank you. Lots to get to today. Thanks for being here. Such an honor. We've only got.
I don't think it's going to get better than the intro, so maybe we got to quit while it's ahead.
Just a little mic drop. We'll end it there. Now, for years, you've been envisioning a brighter future, and this show is called Leadership Now, and so leaders can't get to a future unless they also simultaneously think about the now. And for me, you are what it seems to be the father of the startup playbook. So in today's society, what do you think founders are doing sort of positive or correct when it comes to their leadership now? And then what are they doing incredibly wrong? So no, not all founders are Theranos in mind, right? Behaving badly, but some do. So from your vantage point, your experience, what's going right today in leadership now and what maybe isn't?
I think what's going right for startups is what's always been right, is they tend to see over the horizon. That is, there is no status quo for a startup. There is no legacy. There are no customers. There are no kind of things you promised that you were going to deliver to existing customers. And so they're unburdened by actually having the revenue stream or Wall Street profit goals or end of quarter reporting.
Right.
That's what makes them ability. 100% of a startup is focused on innovation and high-speed delivery. Because even though, we used to have infinite cash for a couple of years, you still had a virtual gun to your head of limited resources and time or time to market, et cetera. Where companies have, smaller percentage of people focused on creating the new, most of them are focused on servicing the now. Mm-hmm. And companies have a different problem of, how do we not get stuck in the existing processes and procedures and OKRs and all the things we build to actually build scale? I mean, they're necessary to build a scalable organization, but pretty rapidly we lose sight about the creativity that actually got us to that point that, that created scale. And there are, some pretty known solutions of building ambidextrous organizations and building organizations that transform when faced with challenges. But that is the notion of creative destruction in both startups and large companies, is that, if they go out of business, there will be someone else to take their place with either a better business model or better understanding technology trends or shifts, whether it's a startup or another company. And I think the difference is certainly in the last 10 or 20 years, we've seen that rate of change just ever increasing. Mm-hmm. And I think we just literally in the last 90 days have seen one that's going to transform every business, large and small. And of course, that's generative AI. There must, if you're a startup and you don't have AI in your pitch deck, you're probably not even getting a meeting. And if you're a large company, an existing company with existing customers, there's someone about to put you out of business if it isn't going to be yourself, about changing your business model, about how some of these technologies are actually going to change how you see customers, they see you. What do you do with the data you've collected and what you're going to collect, et cetera. I think those changes are as profound as I've been around long enough to see the beginning of the microprocessor and the beginning of the PC business. I think it's the sum of those, maybe all within 2 years. So I'll stop babbling. What was your question?
Well, I think what you've touched on is this notion that we must, and you've written and spoken about this many times, we must sort of, quote, get out of the office, look around, and not be stuck in our old ways. We have to embrace change. And your point about generative AI over the past, what seems to be a rapid ascent over the past 90 days or so, you're also worried, however, and whether that's not embracing the change like a generative AI piece, you're worried about things like, the propensity and proclivity for AI to not only from Goldman Sachs prediction, right, of 300 million lost jobs, but this sort of destruction of society writ large. So what are we as leaders not thinking about if you're so worried from a generative AI perspective and what's going on in the business?
Well, if I was a leader in an existing company, I'd be thinking about what could it do for you, and what could a competitor do against you? About customers, about channel, about the supply chain, about all these things. And the good news is, in a large company, we have tools for transformation. I mean, we kind of know that, transformation, typically you think about 4 pieces is, leadership, talent and people, and support processes, and then running those innovation processes, whether it was the last thing was digital transformation. And now I think we're all going to go through an AI transformation, top to bottom. And then how do you run those parallel efforts? I kind of consider the problem is, how do you spin all those plates simultaneously? That is, leadership. I've multiple transformation efforts in large organizations I see is leadership gets it, the innovators on the bottom get it, the frozen middle goes, well, this too will pass, and we don't really change anything because the senior C-suite believes they sent out 2 memos and therefore the company will follow. And the larger the company, I don't have to tell your listeners, the harder it is to kind of move that ship, because it's kind of like Newton's second law: an object in motion continues in motion until hit on the side of the head by a 2x4. That's kind of the corporate transformation version of that. And then how do you change all the support processes, meaning, supply chain, legal, branding, et cetera, that have been set up to protect the core. And now you have people who want to transform that. And how do you not put your existing business at risk? So besides those classic, how do I do corporate transformation? And every large consulting firm from McKinsey on down will be happy to come in and now tell you yet again, AI is, I think I guess I just dawned on me, I'd probably be buying consulting firm stock, because that's probably going to be the biggest recipient of some of these dollars in corporations, because people are going to have to figure out how to yet again replumb their organizations to deal with those kinds of changes. At the same time, Tushman and O'Reilly, with this whole notion of ambidextrous organization, also has a model on how you kind of protect the core, but also how you run disruption in parallel. The best example, I think, in the corporate world for that is, how do you do operational excellence, and how do you do crazy innovation at scale? People don't think about it, but it's SpaceX. Most of your viewers are familiar with SpaceX. Well, they're launching out of 3 launch pads, 2 in Cape Canaveral, 1 in Vandenberg in California, an average every 4.5 days, a rocket into space. And that execution needs to be as pristine as anything that people who deal with customers probably in the world. You can't there is no, like, we kind of got it right. It either gets into orbit or not. And if there are human beings on top, we have lives at stake. And so those people who are on that side of SpaceX are, excuse the phrase, but are anal retentive for all the right reasons. But there's another half of SpaceX that are run by crazy people. And these are the people building the next generation of rockets called Starship. And Elon's charter to them is, if you're not blowing things up, you're not innovating. And then he says, the next sentence, if you're not blowing things up fast enough, you're not innovating fast enough. So you have one half of the company that's incredibly risk averse, will take 0 risks, but another half the company where it's not risks, it's learning and discovery as rapidly as possible. And the last part of this is that they're not silos. They actually have horizontal connections of the people who are doing the operational excellence of launching rockets every 4.5 days are teaching the new rocket designers, here's where the ground service equipment ought to plug in. Gee, we got this wrong. I wish we could have fixed this 10 years ago. And the guys building the new things are actually teaching the existing guys, when no one's looking, you could actually crank up that chamber pressure by another 100 pounds per square inch or whatever. And in fact, they've gotten another 1,000 pounds of payload to space because they made these tiny incremental tweaks that were actually test bedded on the guys who are blowing things up. I use that as an example of large companies can do this at scale, and a good number of them do. You protect the core, and some people call these moonshots, but they're not random events. They're actually tied that eventually the thing that's run by the crazy people will eventually move from the edges into the core. And that is a plan, not just a hope. I don't know if any of that was relevant to your listeners, but I think we're going to have to deal with this now with a much faster cadence than we had to do anything in the last 10 or 15 years. I think this is just like when the internet hit companies. Does anybody remember Blockbuster, or does anybody remember Barnes and Nobles, or sets of bookstores, or a whole set of things that literally got disrupted because the incumbents who owned the business thought it would last forever and did not transform at the right rate of speed. It wasn't that they had a bad business model. Their business model was simply obsoleted.
Yeah, Kodak, BlackBerry / research Motion come to mind, right? I mean, there they were having the patent in the Kodak example of digital photography, and there was in the face of Jim Balsillie and Mike Lazaridis at RIM, the idea of having a camera and a phone and just, eye off the ball and just looking in the myopia of themselves. They're like, they became bureaucratic. Would you agree?
Well, it's the curse of being an incumbent, right? It's the curse of Steve Ballmer when he was president of Microsoft. He had the best numbers on the street of anybody. I mean, Microsoft stock tripled, their profits tripled, or whatever, and he happened to miss every innovation in the 21st century. He missed mobile, missed the search, missed all this stuff. And it wasn't that there were smart people at Microsoft who weren't working on this. They were, but their focus was on the Windows monopoly. And sometimes when you're a monopolist or duopolist, et cetera, you think that lasts forever. Go ask Google what they're feeling right now. When all of a sudden they could absolutely see their lead disappearing because people might be doing search quite differently, literally within the next 18 months. Sometimes those folks, figure out how to do transformation themselves. Microsoft's comeback in the last 5 years under the new CEO is nothing more than amazing. But take a look what happened to IBM when I was a young engineer in the 1980s. No one thought IBM was ever going to go away, and literally within 10 years, it's still around, but not the fearsome, owned the entire computing market company that it was. So leadership is ephemeral in corporations. The thing that took me a while to figure out when I was young was that companies go on that traditional arc, right? They're originally startups, then they kind of grow, and if they don't figure out how to do these series of transformations, and again, Apple before and then after and then during Steve Jobs is a great example of it. Was Apple Computer that was kind of 4% market share, and Steve just literally did transformation after transformation, all within the span of less than 10 years, and reinvented the company every time. It wasn't just the iPhone, it was the App Store, it was the iPod, it was all the services business, etc. That's what companies who last for multiple decades end up doing. And that's kind of hard when, in fact, you're in a current business where you're just simply printing money and profits, and then all of a sudden you realize you don't even have the corporate DNA, because all those crazy people left because it wasn't a very interesting place for them. Doesn't mean it was a bad company. It meant that wasn't their home. And so now, do you acquire? Do you acqui-hire? Do you acquire other talent, or do you figure out how to grow it internally? Those are real challenges for a CEO in a business that needs to be transformed. And as I said as the preamble, man, in the last 90 days, it's at least my conclusion is there isn't a business around the world that isn't going to be hit with some major transformations.
Mm-hmm. So if I could touch on something that you haven't discussed yet, but I think relates to some of this, and that is, especially when you're talking about your former intern's world at SpaceX and Musk, and you've got the crazies and the handholders, if you will, or the tepid folks. In many organizations, you have culture of cultures. And however, you've got the Department of Finance or, the CFO who's controlling purse strings often. And so you have cost efficiency planning or efficiency thinking versus effective thinking. And so you've got the do more with less people versus the people whom want to innovate and say, look, if you don't think about, let's say, Kodak digital photography, our lunch is going to be eaten despite the fact we have 90% market share in film and camera. So you've got CFOs in this culture of fear, do more with less, efficiency mindset. Tell me a bit about how you advise and teach and consult and sort of get people thinking, appreciating, almost empathetically both sides to come at it from, a perhaps better view going forward.
Well, one of the things I remind leadership is that, execution pays your salary, but innovation will pay your pension.
That's good.
And I mean, literally, if you just take 30 seconds to think about it, that's not just a glib line. That actually is why companies last more than a decade. And in fact, if all you want to do is squeeze profits for the next couple of quarters, just go ignore whatever is going to happen. Because then, write the traditional note in an envelope you put in the desk for your successor, which says, prepare another note for your successor. I mean, so it really takes a C-level or sometimes a board level conversation is the status quo still sufficient? And if not, what do we need to do to start being ambidextrous again? As I said, it requires every large company, every organization has innovators at the bottom, banging their heads against the wall against an organization that is designed for execution. What this really takes is transformation from the top, from the leadership that says, okay, this is a serious corporate effort. We're going to have to change support processes. We're going to have to build innovation pipelines. We're going to have to train our people to both execute and innovate. We're going to have, and by the way, my ultimate test for CEOs who say, oh, we have innovation processes, come look at our beanbag chairs and our incubator, and we have great coffee cups and posters. The first thing I ask is, have you changed the incentive plans for any of your middle managers?
Yeah.
I mean, literally, that's the first diagnostic. And they look at, oh, we've sent the memo out. No. Your existing folks have been they've been coming to work with the same job spec, with the same, here's how I do my job, here's how I get incented, this is my promotion and bonus plan and whatever. And if you haven't changed any of that to at least incent different types of work or incented any of them to incent innovation programs, then what's the surprise? And again, I'm only barely being glib here, but there are a couple of diagnostics you could just go in and ask about, well, what have you changed on the people processes to get the rest of the company moving? And what have you changed in organizational design? And by the way, if the same leadership, one level down, is the same leadership you had 5 years ago, you can almost set your watch about shorting your stock. You don't have the same people in a crisis or transformation in all levels of the company that in innovation than you did when you had an execution organization. And again, these are just data points on what a top to bottom transformation effort really looks like. As I said, there's four lines of effort. There's leadership, there's support processes, there's the innovation processes, there's the people, and then it's all coordinated by some form of a transformation office that kind of manages metrics and statistics and responsible for training all that stuff. But it's not just a set of memos or what I call innovation point activities. I have an incubator in my company. Well, that's fine. How much of that stuff has actually gotten to be delivered through your channel, and what's its impact on revenue and profit? Well, let me show you another demo. Well, no. Or gee, we won so-and-so award. Well, that's nice. Show me the things in the hands of the sales force that didn't exist 18 months ago. Well, our pipeline process. Again, things that make sense when you're the market leader in in a stable industry are actually your adversaries. All that legacy process doesn't need to go away, but needs to, in fact, work in parallel with innovation processes that are taking risks or running experiments with a goal to deliver things with speed and urgency. And that's a big idea, is how do we run things in parallel that don't break the core? Like we got an engine that's making us money, but how do we transition the core from the edge back in?
I don't want to put an answer into your mouth, but I do think that you've written before about how the advocacy, or your advocacy, of having wisdom in the room with leaders, and in the alignment to specifically leaders surrounding themselves with pros who have experience. So tell me a bit about how you see that as an alignment piece to ensuring that you are growing, innovating, and not being, quote, the smartest person in the room.
So help me understand, which kind of experienced people?
Well, you've advocated that a leader, CEO, C-suite, somewhere, it doesn't really matter, should have a great alignment with other wisdom, not just themselves. Like, it could be external, it could be internal, it could be both. But tell us how you see and why it's so important for leaders to specifically surround themselves with seasoned, experienced people, and why.
So leaders of large organizations are historically, if they're not the founders of the company, and I want to make the exceptions of the Bezos or the Reed Hastings or the Elon Musk, that is, the founders who are now running large corporations, there really is something to learn if you're a non-founder who have taken over or running a large execution organization. Yeah. And that is, your skill set tends to be finance, marketing, sales, how to build repeatable and scalable processes. And those work fine when the world around you is the world you knew and the world you learned in business school 10, 15 years ago. I remind my students who have left that everything you learned in business school older than 10 years ago is obsolete, except for maybe accounting. That also isn't completely facetious. The tools of innovation and the things that are coming down the pike were probably not in your core classes that you've taken. And it's not, again, if you're a C-level exec, it's not that you are not seeing them, but that isn't what you're living. But there are people around you, inside your company, et cetera, that if you're going to deal with these transformations, you need a number two on your side who truly understand innovation models, innovation pipelines, innovation processes, transformation processes that are as important as the execution processes you've put in place. And as I said, there are great consulting firms that come in and help you do this. But the danger is, and I've seen this multiple times, is that you hire a firm to do this, but you don't quite understand why they're building a matrix organization or why they're standing up a moonshot factory or whatever. Yep. It's almost like when I tell startup founders, if you're hiring a consultant to do something for you, you might as well go out of business. What you want to hire a consultant for is teach you what they know. So in fact, it becomes your knowledge, and obviously I'd pay them double for that. Is don't send somebody to Japan to set up your job. Have somebody take you to Japan and teach you how to do business in Japan. That's quite different from the same is true in a large corporation. If this is the first time you're going through a transformation, for God's sake, don't just outsource all this to a consulting firm. Doesn't mean don't hire one, they're world-class ones, but get in people who will teach you what this means and why they're suggesting to make these types of organizational changes, because you need to have that fingertip feel yourself, or you will just be writing 7- and 8-digit checks for things that may or may not work for your company with your people and your culture. I want to emphasize culture. None of this works without leadership and people who want to follow that leader with a clearly articulated path, with pretty concrete goals and a vision that matches. People will do some extraordinary things if leadership is clear about the why and the how and where we want to go to. Everything from we put men on the moon because it was absolutely clear. If your viewers haven't Googled John Kennedy's speech at Rice University in 1962, in one speech, he articulated why we were going to spend $40 billion to put 2 men on the moon and within the decade. that was it. And he did it in less than probably 12 minutes. If he could do that for the entire country, a CEO should be able to articulate the rationale why, what the goal is, and how we're going to go do it, and then bring in help and surround themselves with the people necessary to do that, understanding what the framework is and understanding what the culture is and understanding how to motivate his specific men and women in that company who want to actually do something different than they've done before. And we've seen companies, we know companies that, people will do anything for that leaders because they're aligned with the leadership. It's not just a job, it's a calling. Mm-hmm. And if you can actually change transformation from, it's one more reorg, instead it's no, we're all aligned to the mission. You have a much better shot about being the survivor of whatever transformation is happening in your industry.
Not because it's hard, but because we can. Now, one of my favorites from you is actually your points about failure. And what I instruct, whether my students or my clients, is that we should be harvesting the value of mistakes so we can iterate and learn from. So what's your take today, Steve, on sort of our culture of failure? Do we have one in the sense of like being able to learn from what we do wrong? Or are we, covering our tracks for fear of reprimand, and thus the culture that you speak of isn't one that is inducing this ability to create and to actually be allowed to fail? Tell me your thoughts on that.
That's a great question, because in a startup, I think it's pretty well understood that this whole lean methodology, this word pivot, that is making substantive changes when you get new data, instead of following a plan to the end of the cliff, you go, well, wait a minute, we have data that says there's a cliff there, perhaps we don't want to drive over it. And in the old days, we would literally drive over it because the plan said go straight.
Right.
And so in a startup, it's pretty clear this methodology of lean and this culture says, if in fact you're learning from the failures, learning and discovery, and you do those failures with what are called minimum viable products, instead of building the entire factory, spending $300 million to outfit it before you discover that there are no customers, you build prototypes, put them in front of customers, realize you need something different, and change the product, and sometimes change the customers. Again, those are called pivots, and you use this notion of MVPs. That's integral to a startup. But what happens in a company is you might have done that on day one and you were successful. You found what was called product market fit. You had the right product with the right features for the right customers, and now you're in execution mode. Yeah. You're building with a factory, you're turning the crank, you've got salespeople who could sell off the price list. They don't need to be creative. Here it is. They need to be skilled at selling, or your website, or you have influencers and whatever it is. And you've forgotten that culture of learning and discovery. And in fact, if you're a head of sales that comes into a company that has found execution, repeatability and scalability, and you screw up, you deserve to be fired, because there was a known process. There were a series of knowns. So failure in execution is failure, but failure in learning and discovery is very different. That's never articulated in a large company. Are we executing knowns and you screw that up? Yeah, you failed. But are we learning new things or trying to start new divisions? And the problem is that in companies, it's very hard to separate out execution processes from learning and discovery, searching for business model processes. And when you try to run them in the same division, so for example, if I have an existing engineering group or an existing functional division that's a product line division, it's very hard to run execution and innovation in there simultaneously, because the cultures just tend to conflict. That's why you tend to make these ambidextrous organizations where you spin out some of these things internally, so you could run different cultures at different speeds with things blowing up, but not blowing up your existing customer base or putting the core at what I call putting the core at risk. Did that help?
Oh my gosh, such a great delineation, which then sprung another question, which potentially relates. And that's the argument that, for much of the 20th century, we've had venture capital and societal interests align, right? And so, kind of like your idea of failure and execution is failure. It's a no. Why the hell are we failing that? But if we're innovating and trying to co-create and ideate something, okay, cool. But it's okay to fail is my point. We've been back to the question. We've been so aligned that most of those investments tended to be, I would just say, ethical, maybe purpose driven, without actually saying the term purpose driven. But it feels like these days that it's been decoupled. And Steve, my question for you is, okay, so VCs are unregulated, fine. They're designed to optimize investor returns. Okay, I can believe that. But then when the board or the C-suite are involved in that short-termism thinking, or the maximization of shareholder return thinking, they're almost, in my opinion, culprits to that. Well, we can't fail. We're only going to focus on EBITDA. So tell me a bit about business climate, society, and the interrelationship between that these days, and your views on that. Well, what's the future of the organization question?
You use the word culprits. I like to use the word unindicted culprits for now.
Okay, I'll take it.
The day there's a perp walk with a VC firm who invested in some of these unethical things, well, we might see a change in culture. But I think you nailed it. Is that in the 21st century, given I don't even know if the SEC is still around. I mean, there are SEC, FTC, all the things that used to have some regulatory control over public and sometimes even private companies have been so demonized that for all the interest who didn't want regulation, you got VCs be able to go home and look their children in the eye and invest in Juul. I mean, that's venture backed and no one shames them on the street, or Facebook, do no evil, maybe, or Google do no evil when they began. But I tell my students, it's, working for Facebook now is, like going to work for the manufacturers of OxyContin. I mean,
wow.
Like now that we know the harm of social media, why would you go do that other than all you can think about? That's the only way you can make some money. And that's at least schools I teach in, that means you probably should have failed your classes. So the problem is both society and the regulatory infrastructure of the United States have changed, as well as this notion of shame has kind of disappeared from venture capitals. That's the bad news. The good news is, what I never thought would happen is the U.S. in the last 2 years has rediscovered national industrial policy. Meaning the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, has actually put the government's thumb on where we're going to put some serious dollars or serious tax breaks and for investors. That has actually encouraged things that are good for society, bringing semiconductors manufacturing back to the U.S. People think of it as jobs and good to have. It might actually deter a war if we could get as much semis out of Taiwan as we can. We now have batteries being manufactured in the U.S. because of incentives, etc. The other thing is for the Department of Defense, they finally have woken up. It's one of the reasons we started the center at the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford, is our view that commercial technology and the DoD have just not met each other yet. The Department of Defense used to own all the advanced technology they needed to deter win a war, whether it was semiconductors or biotech or autonomy, meaning drones or something else, or access to space. All used to come from what are called our federally funded research and development labs, or the military labs, or the prime contractors. And now, I have students who build better AI systems than some of the primes I've seen. And so it's not that people are dumb. It's just that these ecosystems haven't connected since the 1960s, and getting the Department of Defense to get out of their building, which a good number of them don't have windows, is really a difficult task, because they've been very comfortable that the most advanced technology kind of existed in their own little circle of knowledge, and it's just simply no longer true. The only thing that DoD owns probably is the prime contractors know how to integrate complex things at scale better than anybody. No startup is going to do that for a long time. And they own hypersonics and nuclear weapons. And if it was up to Elon, he'd probably own the nukes. And they own what are called exquisite, sensors and kinetic things. But all that other technology, as I said, it's not just Silicon Valley. It's the whole world of innovation, and half of it exists in China. And for the Department of Defense and national security, that's a problem. I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, you did. I mean, it was as always fascinating insight. You go deep and find a way in which to connect a dot from the question I asked, right, about that particular. So I've got two more. You've been kind with your time. One is you've published a rather beautiful line, both of us being authors. So I want to read you the line and then ask you a question about it. So the line is, the measure of a life is not time. It's the impact you make serving God, your family, community, and country. This is what's important here, I think. Your report card is whether the world is a better place. So, Steve, what grade are you giving, generally speaking, leaders in this year 2023 when it comes to making the world a better place?
It's the grades are unevenly distributed. If you look at our politicians, we're in a time that looks a lot like the 1880s and 1890s in the United States. It was a pretty miserable time in the U.S. We did ethnic cleansing. We did all kinds of things that we now kind of look fondly back with a gauzy thing of, most Americans don't even know their history from the end of the Civil War to maybe the beginning of the 20th century. So in context of history, it's bad, but it's been worse. Are there people doing wonderful stuff of, NGOs, nonprofits, people who see the future and want to make it the country and the world a better place? Sure. I think the other problem is that when we've not regulated media in the United States, it's the same thing about, we go to the lowest common denominator without any regulation. A lot of the media is the jewel of media. I pick on Jewel because I think it did massive harm to teenagers and made investors a ton of money. I think a lot of the media we have works on the same principle. It doesn't matter. We've figured out what the equivalent of the media drug is to get people engaged on bad news or permanent outrage is a way to get people addicted. And that's not healthy for a country. But at least in this country, we've kind of figured out that no one will take the chance of regulating it because people will spend the dollars that they're making to stop people from regulating it. So I don't know if I answered your question. I am hopeful. I teach students, I think much like you do, and see how passionate they are about doing something important, whether it's for profit or nonprofit. And I don't see them wallowing in despair. I see them again entering the world with not only hope but confidence that they could change the world, and that should give us all a lot of hope. Is that some of them will. We just don't know which ones they are. So I pass all of them.
Excellent. Well, speaking of that, last question. I'm laughing already because there's a second follow-up to it. Who's your favorite, Eric Ries or Alex Osterwalder? I'm just kidding. What have those two meant to you ultimately? Because they certainly look up to you. They're friends of the show, of course.
Well, if you think about it, the lean methodology, at least as I teach it, is, I kind of started the first piece, which was customer discovery, but then it was Eric who said, Eric was the first practitioner of this, and his observation immediately was, Steve, customer discovery belongs paired with agile engineering. And while he didn't invent it, he was the first one to take advantage of it. And he said, you grew up in a world of waterfall, which is a series of engineering steps. And he grew up in a world that was just discovering agile. Why don't we pair them together? Yeah. And then when I started teaching this stuff at Stanford, I was struggling with how do I put it all in context. And one of my teaching assistants, who's now a co-founder of Floodgate, Ann Miraco, said, hey, I found this book you ought to read. And I had been reading literature, trying to figure out who's best describes something rather than a business plan. I said, well, first you got to read this PhD thesis. And she said, no, you got to read this book. And we passed it across each other. And I had handed her Osterwalder's PhD thesis, and she had handed his first book, Business Model Generation. And then we realized we just needed to adopt the business model canvas. And then Lean became customer development, agile engineering, and the business model canvas to keep track of all the moving parts that, or at least 80% of the moving parts you need to think about when you're transforming a business. So between the three of us, I think we created the form of what we would can honestly call modern entrepreneurship in the 21st century. And I remind folks that that academics had been writing about these pieces for years, and I think the value all three of us brought, Reese and Osterwalder and Blank, was not that we invented this stuff. Is number one, this was best practices that people were doing anyway. They just didn't have the words to describe it. And two is, it was stuff that you could probably dig through all the academic papers in the 20th century and find out that, yeah, they were publishing all this stuff in journals that no practitioner ever read or will read. So it wasn't like we were the smartest people on the planet. We were the people who actually created tool sets that normal human beings who were trying to build and run companies could go use. And I think it's been an interesting run. I will close to say, I think the run of lean is over. And I think at least I could sketch out on a whiteboard how today and for sure within 12 months that a good chunk of AI tools will kind of replace that human-centered model of customer discovery, agile engineering, and business model generation with a set of tool set that could probably do 100x better than a single person. And so it's going to be an interesting ride for everybody.
Well, you've been prescient before, and if you leave us with that set of prescient observation, then can't wait to see if that works out well for all of us, sir. You're a prolific writer, a prolific thinker. Where can we find out more about the great Steve Blank?
I write on steveblank.com. There's a variety of topics depending on the weather and what the interest is of this week. And I teach full time now at Stanford in both the engineering school and national policy.
Well, you're a legend by all stretches and imagination. Thank you for everything you've done and what you continue to do. This is such a thrill for me, I must say. Once again, thank you, Mr. Blank.
All right. Thanks for having me, Dan.
All right, everyone. Another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract. Today in the house, the one, the only Steve Blank. Look for more at steveblank.com.